the past doesn't need you anymore. The future does, and in recovery programs, you often hear, we don't regret the past nor wish to, but we don't wish to shut the door on it, because in there lies the lessons and the remembering of who we used to be in order to help us propel forward to who we feel we're meant to be. Right. And I think it is important to check the rearview mirror every so often to see how far we've come. We forget that. Like when we are in the pursuit of our own greatness, we don't realize it's that science. I mean, studies have proven this. When we're in the pursuit of something that we think is going to make our lives better, we're actually unhappy during the pursuit. And when we finally achieve it, there's a spike that occurs. And people think that this spike is because we've actually acquired it. That's part of it. The truth is, we are so unhappy on the cusp of actually that achievement that it spikes us our unhappiness. So, what does that have to do with death? Well, in order for us to become the person that we want to be, that experiences that achievement, the person that we used to be has to die. We've heard this said already on this podcast, and that is an unhappy experience. And when we die, that version of ourselves, there's a grief process that takes place. And I don't know about you, but I find in my history that a lot of people handle grief in various ways. I tend to live more in the denial and the anger of that grief process than I do on the other side, where there's the acceptance and in the lifting process. The importance of being able to see where you're going, to see where you've come from, is important. And there's a reason why the windshield is much bigger, right? Because you need to be clear on where you're going and where and focus on that. Now, in regards to the ego, I think the one thing that I would say I would disagree with Josh with is the idea of trying to kill the ego. I don't think the ego can die. Like I'm of the faith that even Gandhi himself had an ego, because you needed an ego in order to pull off what he did. Right. And so this idea of like the ultimate ego death, I think is not something that can be experienced. I mean, it's probably a 1 in a billion chance that you can live in this existence and not have an ego. So, not to say that you don't have to, you shouldn't strive for it, right? But just accepting the odds of that not happening. What I've discovered is that I think the ego has a place, as Josh said, right? It has a place because it allows us to be safe. It's the part that gives us the confidence to do what we need to do. It's the part that allows us to be spontaneous and be responsive when things kind of either come awry or something, a new opportunity shows up. But I think a big mistake a lot of people have is that they let their ego be at the head of the table. They let the ego become the person that runs the house, right? And I've been in that experience too. And I literally had to do a work experience where I had to sit at different seats and play the roles of the different versions of me that was running in my head. It felt like I was like losing it. But what I understood from that was there are parts of me that run my life. And the part that I don't want at the head of the table is the ego. But I also don't want to shame and shun the ego, because it does have an important role in my life. Doing this podcast is one of the things that my ego actually allows me to do. So to try to kill it off doesn't actually feel productive for the life that I want to live. So what I do is I give it a seat at the table, just not the head. And when his number is called, I get excited about it because I know he'll come through. He is automated. He is programmed to deliver what he is designed to deliver. He doesn't even have a consciousness. So I don't have to worry about him having to think about whether or not it's the right thing to do. He's just going to act because that's how the ego is designed. Right. But
Yes.
there are these moments where when you have your soul at the head of the table, that person is going to have the final say. And the ego might be resistant to that. And that's where the death occurs. Now, the ego, and I'm going along with this because I think this part is really important. The ego, its program is, I don't want to die. Right.
Right.
The ego does not want to die, and it'll do everything it possibly can. Now, remember I said it doesn't have a conscience. So it doesn't actually realize that it needs a host to exist, but it's willing to even kill its host in order for it to survive. Right. So anyone who's, suffering in addiction or some type of deep depression or other forms of clinical mental illness, or not clinical, this is something that can happen. right? The ego doesn't want to die. So it's doing everything it can to protect itself, even if it means killing the host itself. But the ego with the soul wants to live. The soul wants to be free, right? And what I've learned is both actually want the same thing. It's kind of like Neo and Smith in the Matrix, right? Like, you know, in the first Matrix, you actually hear Smith say that he wants to be free. It's actually the only time he says it in the whole series. But that's why he's doing what he does, because he wants to be free. And what does Neo want to do? Neo wants to free minds, right? But because of how they're programming, they went about it in completely different direction. So what we got to do is, and how this relates to death is, the ego needs to not realize it's dying. That's the key, right?
Huh.
If your soul can convince your ego to come along for the ride that it's taking itself, that you're taking it on, the ego won't realize that it's dying. A little piece of itself is being left behind as it follows along on this journey. And that's a really, really, I almost think of like it's an eternal process that we go through. And I think that's really where the ego can die and still live in its purpose.
Yeah, I like the way that you phrased that, which is think was you phrased what I was trying to say a lot better. So I definitely appreciate the way that you out there because it's true. The ego is a very useful, essential part of yourself. It's just sometimes the ego needs to be reminded like it works for you, not the
Mhm.
other way around, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And the ego too, like you said it, both of you guys said it, the ego wants pleasure.
Yeah.
That's what it's seeking out for. And we're also seeking out pleasure. We want peace and happiness. When you look at it from like an evolutionary standpoint too, like our ego is designed to keep us from getting eaten by like a tiger.
Yeah.
So there is a very important purpose in it. It's just that today, because we've advanced in our consciousness, we have so many other things around us now. It can easily get distracted by the shiny object syndrome, relationships, money, all that stuff.